In March 2012, a man was led out of a prison colony in handcuffs. Someone law enforcement was rushing to deport to Georgia faster than any other inmate. Koba Tsertsvazdze, known in criminal circles as Koba Bagdatsky and Koba Tsertsvazdze, was not the most famous thief-in-law of his time, but that is precisely what made him more dangerous than many. While his legendary patron, Taro, shone at the criminal summit and drew the attention of every intelligence service in the world, Koba operated in the shadows, and it was precisely there where police spotlights do not shine that the darkest deeds of the criminal world were carried out. When a search turned up heroin on him, operatives smiled knowingly. The drugs were merely a pretext to rid themselves of a man whose presence on Russian soil was considered intolerable. So what did this thief know and do that the authorities were prepared to go to any lengths just to expel him from the country? To understand Koba Bagdatsky's place in the criminal hierarchy, one must go back to the late 1970s and early 1980s, when Georgian thieves-in-law began their triumphant ascent to the summit of the Soviet criminal world. In those years, the prisons and penal colonies of the USSR were becoming the forges of a new criminal aristocracy, a hierarchy born amid the thunder of prison locks and the grinding of iron bars, one that would later control billion-dollar flows in the 1990s. Georgia had always held a special place in the criminal world of the Soviet Union. It was a republic where the concepts of honor, oath, and blood brotherhood carried a weight passed down from generation to generation. Georgian thieves were distinguished by iron discipline, unconditional observance of the thieves' code, and, most importantly, the ability to stick together. Where Russian thieves often clashed among themselves, divided zones of influence, and cut each other's throats over every spare ruble, the Georgians acted as one fist.
Their cohesion made them unbeatable.
In the late 1970s, a wave of coronations, initiations into the thieves-in-law, swept through the prisons and colonies of the Soviet Union. Among those who received the crown in those years was the young Tariel Oniani, a native of the mining city of Tkibuli. He was barely 17 when he received his first sentence for theft and robbery. But even then, in his youth, this wiry Georgian with burning eyes and an unbending will showed that he was born for the criminal world. His coronation in the late 1970s was the beginning of a legend that would endure for decades. Taro, as Tariel was known in criminal circles, quickly became one of the leaders of the so-called Kutaisi group, one of the most influential Georgian organized crime factions. This group was distinguished by particular brutality and, at the same time, the strictest discipline. The Kutaisi men did not forgive betrayal. They punished any deviation from the thieves' laws with such mercilessness that even hardened prison authorities shuddered at the mere mention of Taro's name. But Taro was not alone in his rise. Around him formed a whole constellation of loyal comrades, men who swore their devotion to him and were ready to walk through fire and flood for him. It was precisely within this circle of chosen ones that Koba Tsertsvazdze found himself, the man destined to become one of the most reliable pillars of Taro's criminal empire. Little is known about Koba Bagdatsky's early years, and this is no surprise. In the criminal world, one does not spread news of one's past, especially when that past is tied to dark deeds better kept secret. But from fragmentary information that has survived to this day, one can reconstruct an approximate picture of how a young Georgian boy from Kutaisi or Baghdadi made his way from street hooligan to thief-in-law. In the Soviet Union of the 1980s, a criminal career usually began early. At 14 or 15,
teenagers were already catching the police's eye, first for petty theft, then for hooliganism, then for more serious offenses. The first stretch in prison became a kind of initiation. It was in the juvenile colony that a young man either broke, becoming a frightened creature, or was tempered like steel in fire and emerged ready for true criminal life. Koba, by all accounts, belonged to the second type. He quickly absorbed the prison laws, grasped the hierarchy of the zone, learned to keep his word, and never cooperated with the administration. In those years, that was precisely what determined whether a person would become accepted in the criminal world or remain forever an outcast. Koba chose the path of the blatnie, the underworld elite, and that choice defined the entire rest of his fate. After his release, he returned to Georgia, but not for long. The criminal world of that era was fluid and dynamic. Thieves moved throughout the entire Union, establishing connections, attending gatherings, resolving disputes that could only be settled with the participation of respected authorities. Koba began appearing at such gatherings, first as a junior participant, then as an equal. Senior thieves noticed him, valued his composure, his intelligence, and above all, his loyalty to the thieves' code. Coronation as a thief-in-law is not merely a ceremony. It is recognition that a man fully meets the strict criteria of the criminal world. He has served sufficient time in prison. He has never broken under pressure. He has not cooperated with the authorities. He is prepared to give his life for the thieves' laws. Koba passed all these tests. When he was crowned, probably in the mid or late 1980s, he became part of the elite of Soviet crime, a man whose word carried weight, whose decisions were binding. But unlike many other thieves-in-law, Koba did not seek publicity. He gave no interviews, did not surround himself with crowds of lackeys, did not flaunt wealth. He preferred to remain in the shadows. And that was his strength. Because in the criminal world, especially in the 1990s and 2000s, figures who shone too brightly quickly became targets, either for the killers of rival factions or for law enforcement. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, a golden era began for the criminal world. Everything that had previously been under state control suddenly became ownerless. Factories, shops, oil rigs, transport arteries, all of it was divided among those with enough strength and audacity to claim their share. And thieves-in-law were among the first to understand what opportunities were opening up in this chaos. Georgian factions found themselves in a winning position in this battle for property redistribution. They were more cohesive, better organized, tougher. They had a clear hierarchy, established communication channels between different cities and republics, and iron discipline. The Kutaisi group, led by TARO, became one of the most powerful criminal structures in the post-Soviet space. TARO in those years was at the peak of his power. He controlled enormous financial flows, had connections in the Georgian government, and was feared and respected from Moscow to Tbilisi. But Taro's strength lay not only in his personal qualities. It lay in the people who surrounded him. And one of the most reliable of those people was Koba Bagdatsky. Koba filled a role that in military hierarchy would be called the Gray Cardinal. He was not in the foreground. His name rarely appeared in law enforcement reports, but many important decisions passed through him. When a conflict between groups needed to be settled, when a gathering needed to be organized, when someone had to be punished for violating the thieves' laws, Koba was the man people turned to for advice and assistance. In the 1990s, a wave of criminal wars swept across Russia.
Factions cut down each other for control over markets, factories, and trading outlets. The streets of cities turned into battlegrounds where shots rang out and explosions detonated daily. In that hell, only the most cunning, most brutal, and most far-sighted survived. The Kutaisi group not only survived, it flourished. This was achieved not only through force, but through the ability to negotiate, find compromises, and build alliances. And in these matters, Koba's role was enormous. He knew how to conduct negotiations, how to persuade, how to find solutions that satisfied everyone. This was a rare gift in a world where arguments were usually settled with bullets and explosives. By the late 1990s, criminal groups from the former USSR had begun actively developing Europe. The collapse of the Union opened borders, and thousands of people flooded westward, seeking better lives, new opportunities. Among these people were thieves-in-law, who quickly understood that the European market was a gold mine that no one had yet properly worked. Georgian factions were among the first to establish themselves in Europe. They settled in France, Spain, Belgium, Austria, and Germany. Their activities were diverse, from drug trafficking to extortion, from money laundering to arms trading. European law enforcement initially did not understand what they were dealing with. They were accustomed to the Italian Mafia, to Albanian and Turkish factions, but Georgian thieves were something new to them and very dangerous. Taro became one of the key figures in this European expansion. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, he regularly appeared in various European countries, met with local criminal authorities, and established contacts. Belgian authorities had already taken notice of him in 1993, when it emerged that he had convictions in Georgia for theft, illegal possession of weapons, and drug trafficking. But at that point, they could not prove anything, and Taro continued his activities. Koba Bagdatsky, in those years, was also actively working the European front. Although specific details of his European activities are scarce, it is known that he maintained links between Georgian factions in various countries, coordinated their actions, and resolved conflicts. In the criminal world, such people are worth their weight in gold. Because without reliable couriers, without people who can be trusted with the most secret matters, no organization can function. One of the loudest cases in which Taro was implicated was the kidnapping of an Israeli businessman in the early 2000s. French intelligence intercepted telephone conversations from which it followed that Taro's partners were demanding $500,000 for the hostage's release. This was standard practice for criminal groups of that era, to kidnap wealthy people and extort ransom from their families. But in this instance, the French obtained such detailed information that they were able to build an entire case against Oniani. The wiretaps also revealed Taro's involvement in an assassination attempt against former Georgian Defense Minister Georgi Karkarashvili. This was no longer merely a criminal matter. It was high-level politics. Karkarashvili was an influential figure in Georgia, and an attempt on his life meant that criminal structures were prepared to intervene in high politics, to eliminate inconvenient people, to influence the balance of power within the state. But the loudest case was the Vienna murder, the key to which was also provided by French wiretapping. A criminal authority had been killed in Vienna, and investigators had long been unable to determine who was behind it. The French recordings of conversations among people in Taro's circle shed light on this case and showed how far-reaching and dangerous the network controlled by Georgian thieves truly was. For a thief-in-law, prison is not the end of a career. It is simply another form of existence. In Soviet and Russian prisons, thieves-in-law always occupied a special position. They were the elite of the criminal world. Their word was law for thousands of prisoners. Their decisions were carried out without question. Prison administration might control procedural matters, but real power in the barracks and on the grounds belonged to the thieves. Koba Bagdatsky, like many thieves-in-law, spent a significant portion of his life behind bars. In 2009, he was detained in the Moscow region on charges of drug possession and received 3 years. For an experienced thief, this was another stretch, one more assignment to the zone. But for law enforcement, it was an opportunity to rid themselves of a dangerous criminal authority. While serving his sentence, operatives conducted an audit of his Russian passport. It emerged that the document had been obtained through violations. In effect, it was forged. This gave the authorities a legal basis for deportation. When Koba's sentence was nearing its end, the decision was made not to release him on Russian soil, but to expel him immediately to Georgia. This decision was no accident. Law enforcement understood perfectly that after release, Koba would return to his criminal activities. He was too authoritative, too connected to powerful criminal structures. His presence in Russia would have meant the strengthening of Georgian factions, new criminal schemes, new crimes. Therefore, the decision was made to act preemptively. In March 2012, the special operation to deport Koba Tsertsvazdze was carried out by the GUUR of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, jointly with the Federal Penitentiary Service. He was taken from the colony and escorted to the airport, from where he was sent to Georgia. The aim, as officially stated by the GUUR press service, was to prevent the resumption of criminal activity by the criminal authority upon his release. This was a blow to the Kutaisi group, but far from a fatal one. Georgian thieves had always known how to adapt to changing conditions, find new people, restore severed connections. Koba returned to Georgia, but his ties to Russian and European crime went nowhere. While Koba was being deported from Russia, his patron and leader Taro was experiencing his own troubles. In 2009, Tariel Oniani was arrested in Russia on charges of kidnapping and extorting money from businessman Johnny Managadze. According to the case materials, the victim stated that he had been tortured in a cafe, that money had been demanded, and that all of it had been done on Taro's instructions. For Taro, accustomed to impunity and enormous influence, the arrest was a shock. But even in pre-trial detention and in the colony, he remained a thief-in-law, a man who submits to no prison rules. He was sent to one of Russia's most severe colonies, Черный Delfin, Black Dolphin, known for its brutal regime. There, the most dangerous criminals were held, serial killers, terrorists, and leaders of criminal organizations. But even in Black Dolphin, Taro did not break. During his sentence, he committed 253 regime violations, for which he was sent to the punishment cell 8 times and to solitary confinement twice. For the colony's administration, he was a nightmare, uncontrollable, unbending, demonstratively contemptuous of any attempts to re-educate him. For the criminal world, this was proof of his status. A genuine thief-in-law never submits to prison authority. In 2015, Taro was released from the Russian prison, but his freedom did not last long. In 2019, he was detained in Moscow and extradited to Spain, where he was wanted on charges of money laundering. Spanish authorities had long been surveilling him, gathering evidence of his ties to criminal structures, and finally obtained the opportunity to try him. In Spain, Taro was sentenced to a lengthy term. Many in the criminal world believed this was the end of his career, that he would never return to freedom. But in October 2021, an event occurred that shook the entire criminal world. Tariel Oniani was released from the Spanish prison. He was already past 60, had spent many years behind bars, but his authority had not wavered. On the contrary, many criminal experts predicted that after his release,
Taro could claim a place as the new leader of the Russian criminal world. By the time of Taro's release and Koba's deportation, the criminal world was no longer what they had known in the 1990s and early 2000s. The state had intensified pressure on criminal structures. New laws had been introduced that allowed thieves-in-law to be imprisoned merely for their status. Many authorities had been killed, others sentenced to lengthy terms, still others deported. Georgian factions were also going through difficult times. In Georgia itself, after the revolution of 2003, power was seized by Mikhail Saakashvili, who launched a harsh campaign against organized crime. Many Georgian thieves were forced to flee the country. Others landed in prison. Those who remained free tried to keep a low profile and avoid drawing attention to themselves. But the old connections did not disappear. Despite all law enforcement efforts, Georgian thieves continued to control certain spheres of the criminal business. Drug trafficking, money laundering, smuggling, extortion. All of these directions continued to bring in millions. And people like Koba Bagdatsky, even while residing in Georgia after deportation, continued to play their role in this system. Koba was one of those who knew how to adapt. He understood that times had changed, that one could not operate as in the 1990s. Now one had to be more careful, more cunning, and make use of new technologies and new schemes. The criminal world was becoming ever more complex, ever more sophisticated, and those who could not adapt were quickly knocked out of the game. Koba's connections with Russia and Europe remained strong. Through trusted intermediaries, he continued to participate in resolving criminal matters, give advice, and settle conflicts. In the criminal world, such people are called smotriashchi, overseers, or pologensi, deputies. They oversee compliance with the thieves' laws, settle disputes, and coordinate the activities of different criminal factions. The 2000s and 2010s were a time of fierce conflicts within the criminal world. Old authorities were leaving the stage. New ones were striving to take their place. This led to confrontations that frequently ended in blood. One of the most famous conflicts of this period was the standoff between different factions for control over Moscow and other major Russian cities. On one side stood the Georgian thieves. On the other, representatives of other Caucasian republics and Slavic factions. Each side laid claim to its share of the criminal pie, and no one was willing to yield. In these conflicts, prominent thieves-in-law were killed, their associates shot, and cars carrying criminal authorities blown up. Law enforcement tried to exploit these tensions for their own purposes, setting factions against one another and arresting leaders at their most vulnerable moments. The Georgian factions to which Koba belonged tried to stick together. Their strength had always been in unity, in the fact that they supported each other in any situation. When one Georgian thief was arrested, the rest collected money for lawyers, supported his family, and did everything possible to secure his release. This solidarity made them stronger than many other factions. But even among Georgians, conflicts occurred. Ambitions, money, power, all of these could become causes of a split. There were cases where Georgian thieves killed one another, where old friends became mortal enemies. In such situations, the role of people like Koba became critically important. They were the ones who could put out a conflict, find a compromise, and prevent bloodshed. By the 2000s, the criminal business had become far more complex than in the turbulent 1990s. Where earlier the main sources of income had been racketeering, control over trading outlets, and simple robberies, criminal structures had now mastered far more sophisticated schemes. Money laundering had become an entire industry. Criminal proceeds passed through chains of shell companies, offshore firms, and front people. Money was transferred from country to country, converted into real estate, stocks, and gems. By the time law enforcement began unraveling the tangle, The trails had already been carefully obscured. Drug trafficking remained one of the most profitable directions. Georgian factions had established supply channels from Afghanistan and Central Asia into Russia and Europe. Heroin, cocaine, synthetic drugs, all of this flowed in a continuous stream, bringing in millions of dollars. Koba Bagdatsky himself was caught with heroin in 2009, which speaks to his involvement in this business. Extortion also went nowhere. It simply became more civilized. Now there was no smashing of shop windows or shooting at businessmen. Instead, well-dressed men arrived, politely offered protection, and explained that without it, business would be difficult to run. And entrepreneurs paid, because they knew that refusal could cost them their business or even their lives. Car theft and smuggling, arms trafficking, the organization of underground casinos, prostitution, the list of criminal directions was enormous. And to coordinate all this activity, one needed people who kept thousands of threads in their heads, knew who owed what to whom, who was in conflict with whom, and who could resolve any given matter.
Koba Bagdatsky was precisely such a man. One of the most dangerous and at the same time most profitable spheres for the criminal world was connections with politicians and officials. In the 1990s and 2000s, the boundary between legitimate power and the criminal world was very blurred. Many businessmen who made their fortunes in the turbulent 1990s had criminal pasts. Many politicians were connected to criminal groups, received money from them for elections, and rendered them services. In Georgia, this connection was especially visible. In the 1990s, after the collapse of the Union, criminal authorities effectively became part of the political establishment. Jaba Ioseliani, one of the most famous Georgian thieves-in-law, became a deputy in the Supreme Council of Georgia and an advisor to President Eduard Shevardnadze. He had spent approximately 25 years in prison, but this did not prevent him from making a political career. Such examples showed that in the new independent states, crime and power could exist in symbiosis. Politicians needed money and force support that criminal structures could provide. Crime needed protection from law enforcement and the ability to legalize its income, and politicians could provide this. TARO, as one of the leaders of Georgian organized crime, also had political connections. His alleged involvement in the assassination attempt against Georgian Defense Minister Georgi Karkarashvili shows that he was entangled in a high-stakes political game. The elimination of inconvenient politicians, influence over elections, pressure on officials, all of this was part of the activities of major criminal groups. Koba, as TARO's right hand, was also privy to these political intrigues. He was the man through whom important messages were passed, meetings arranged, and delicate matters resolved. In a world where one careless word could cost you your life, such people were worth their weight in gold. To understand people like Koba Bagdatsky, one must understand the psychology of a thief-in-law. This is not merely a criminal who breaks the law for money. This is a man who lives by special rules, for whom the thieves' code takes precedence over state law, for whom honor and one's word carry absolute value. A thief-in-law cannot work. This is one of the fundamental rules. He cannot have official income, cannot serve in the army, cannot cooperate with the authorities. His life is a constant conflict with the state, a constant existence outside the law. But in return, he receives the respect of the criminal world, power over people, and the ability to influence events. For such people, prison is not a punishment, but a test of resilience. A thief-in-law must be able to endure any sentence without breaking, without betraying his own.
Every year behind bars adds to his authority and makes him more respected in criminal circles. Therefore, they do not fear prison. They regard it as an inevitable part of their lives. Koba, who spent a significant portion of his life in places of confinement, was a typical representative of this breed of men. He did not complain about his fate, did not try to ease his situation by cooperating with the administration. He served his sentences as befits a thief, with head held high without losing his dignity. But what drives a man to choose such a life? Why does he not try to live normally, legally, peacefully? For people like Koba, such questions simply have no meaning. They were born and raised in an environment where the thieves' code was the norm, where a prison sentence was a mark of manhood, where betrayal was punished with death. For them, this is the only world they know and understand. One of the most important institutions of the criminal world is the shodka, a gathering of thieves-in-law at which the most critical questions of criminal life are resolved. At gatherings, conflicts between factions are settled, decisions are made on the coronation of new thieves, and verdicts are handed down to those who have violated the thieves' laws. Gatherings are held in strict secrecy. The location is chosen in advance, usually some remote area where any outside surveillance can be detected. Participants arrive one at a time or in small groups, trying not to attract attention. Dozens of thieves-in-law may be present at a gathering, each representing a particular faction or region. Koba Bagdatsky, as an authoritative thief and Taro's trusted man, regularly participated in such gatherings. His opinion carried weight and his words were heeded. When a difficult conflict needed to be resolved and opinions were divided, it was men like Koba who could tip the scales one way or another. The decisions of a gathering are binding. No one can challenge or ignore them. Anyone who does not comply with a gathering's decision automatically becomes an outcast from the criminal world, and his life is placed in jeopardy. This creates a rigid system of control that allows the criminal world to exist and function despite all law enforcement efforts. The criminal world has its own language, not only verbal, but symbolic. Tattoos, gestures, certain words and expressions, all of these carry meaning that is understandable only to the initiated. The tattoos of a thief-in-law are his biography written on his skin. Every symbol means something. Stars on the shoulders indicate high status, church domes indicate the number of stretches served, cards or dice indicate a passion for gambling. An experienced person can read the entire life of a thief from his tattoos, where he was imprisoned, for what, and what place he occupies in the hierarchy. Koba, as a genuine thief-in-law, almost certainly bore classical criminal tattoos. They were his passport in the criminal world, his identity document. In prison, one glance at a person's tattoos was sufficient to understand who stood before you. The thieves' argo is a separate language that is constantly evolving and changing. Many words came from pre-revolutionary prisons. Some were borrowed from Yiddish, Romani, and other languages. This language serves several purposes. It creates a sense of belonging to a special group. It allows communication in a way outsiders cannot understand, and it serves as a marker identifying a person as one of us. All of this creates a special subculture that exists parallel to official societal culture. For those who live within it, this subculture is more real and more important than everything else. They do not acknowledge the laws of the state, but sacredly observe the laws of the criminal world. In the end, the entire criminal world revolves around money. The thieves' code, laws, hierarchy, all of these are mechanisms for controlling financial flows. Whoever controls the money controls everything. In the 1990s and 2000s, Georgian factions controlled billion-dollar flows. Drug trafficking brought in hundreds of millions of dollars per year. Money laundering, smuggling, racketeering, illegal trade, all of this added up to enormous sums. And this money needed to be properly distributed so that the system could function. Part of the money went to bribes for officials and police. Without this, criminal business could not be conducted. Part went to maintaining fighters who provided armed support. Part went into the obchak, the thieves' common fund, from which arrested thieves and their families were helped. Part went to the personal enrichment of faction leaders. Koba Bagdatsky, as one of the key figures in the Kutaisi faction, had access to considerable financial resources. He controlled certain financial flows, decided where to direct money, whom to help, and whom to punish. In the criminal world, financial control equals power, and Koba possessed this power. Today, many criminologists and experts speak of the era of classical thieves-in-law drawing to a close. The state has learned to fight organized crime effectively. New laws allow thieves to be imprisoned simply for their status, and special operations knock out criminal leaders one by one. But the criminal world demonstrates remarkable resilience. It has existed for more than 100 years, surviving revolution, wars, Stalinist repressions, perestroika, and the collapse of the Union. Each time it seemed to be coming to an end, it was reborn in a new form. Koba Bagdatsky and his generation of thieves are a bridge between the old and new eras. They grew up in Soviet prisons, passed through the turbulent 1990s, and learned to operate in the new conditions of the 2000s. They saw how the criminal world changed, how old methods ceased to work, and how one had to adapt in order to survive. The younger generation of thieves learns from men like Koba. They absorb experience, learn history, and understand how to act in modern conditions. Perhaps they will no longer be called thieves-in-law. Perhaps they will have different titles and different rules, but the essence will remain the same. These will be people who live outside the state's law, who control the criminal business, and who hold power in the underworld. Koba Bagdatsky was never in the foreground. He gave no interviews, his photographs rarely appeared in the press, and his name did not resound as did the names of Taro or other famous thieves. But it was precisely men like Koba who were the backbone of the criminal world. While bright figures attracted the attention of law enforcement and journalists, men like Koba did the real work. They forged connections, resolved conflicts, coordinated the activities of factions, and controlled financial flows. They were the gray cardinals of the criminal world, and without them, the entire system could not have functioned. The story of Koba Bagdatsky is the story of a man who consciously chose to remain in the shadows. He understood that a bright spotlight attracts not only admiring glances, but also the bullets of killers and the attention of intelligence services. He preferred to work quietly, inconspicuously, and effectively. His deportation in 2012 was an acknowledgement of his significance. Law enforcement would not have expended such effort on a man who posed no danger. The very fact that they specially looked for a way to rid themselves of him speaks to the fact that Koba was an important figure whose presence in Russia created problems for the authorities. Koba Bagdatsky remains an enigma. Little specific information is known about him. His biography is full of gaps. But therein lies his role, to be a man of shadow, a man who does important work but remains invisible. In the criminal world, there is room for different people. There are bright leaders like Taro, whose names everyone knows, who are feared and respected. There are brutal killers who carry out sentences. There are financiers who launder money and construct complex schemes. And there are people like Koba, reliable, loyal, capable of keeping their mouths shut. These people do not write memoirs, do not appear in documentaries, and do not give interviews. They live and work in the shadows, and only when they are arrested or deported does it briefly become visible what an important role they played. Koba Bagdatsky lived his life on the boundary between freedom and prison, between legality and crime, between light and shadow. He was the loyal comrade of one of the most powerful thieves-in-law of his time. He participated in events that determined the balance of forces in the criminal world. He was part of a story not yet written to its end. Today, wherever Koba may be, he remains what he has always been, a thief-in-law, a man of the criminal world, a man for whom the thieves' code takes precedence over the laws of the state. His story is the story of an entire generation of Georgian thieves who built one of the most powerful criminal networks in the post-Soviet space. And as long as the criminal world exists, as long as there are people prepared to live by its laws, the story of men like Koba Bagdatsky will continue, in the shadow, far from the eyes of ordinary citizens, but nonetheless real and nonetheless important for that. Increasingly intertwined were the fear and respect the criminal world felt toward him. Stories circulated about Koba, that he could sit for hours listening to two factions argue over a share of a business, then, in 5 sentences, lay everything out so clearly that both sides understood. Further argument was pointless. The decision had already been made. Those who left such conversations said that the most frightening thing about being near him was not the threat, but the silence. He never shouted, never banged his fist on the table, but everyone understood. If the agreement was not honored now, there would be no next conversation at all. Law enforcement felt this too. When security forces described his role in their reports, they noted separately. He never appeared at showdowns where surveillance teams and cameras might be present, preferring to act through several intermediary links. For operatives, this was a headache. The chains had to be unraveled over months, but they always ended up at the same place. At the other end of the thread sat Koba, who was officially registered as an ordinary prisoner, not as a general of the criminal world. It was precisely because of this double image, formally secondary, effectively pivotal, that he was considered one of the most dangerous men in Taro's circle. Particularly telling was his standing in the colonies. Every penal colony has its own authorities, but there are also men whose names are spoken in hushed tones. Koba was recalled in precisely that way, not as a boisterous prisoner, but as the one who could stop any barracks brawl with a single look. He did not live in luxury, even by prison standards. No ostentatious flash, no desire to turn his cell into an office. This distinguished him radically from the new business authorities, accustomed to the comfortable conditions that money could buy. Such behavior was taken as a sign of the old school, respect for the obshchak, contempt for domestic luxury, and exacting standards for himself and others. After his deportation to Georgia, according to those who tracked the transformation of the criminal environment, he did not simply dissolve into obscurity, as many had done, but carefully fitted himself into the new realities. The old channels to Russia and Europe went nowhere. Only the means of communication changed. Where previously couriers had flown with notes, now encrypted messengers and smartphones registered to front people were used. But the principle remained the same. The word of an authority, spoken in Tbilisi, could influence decisions in Moscow or Madrid, if behind that word stood the reputation of decades. Meanwhile, the era around him was changing at breakneck speed. Young lawmakers, crowned in the 2000s and 2010s, often came to this world not from prison barracks, but through money and connections. Behind them stood groups of businessmen prepared to pay for the requisite status.
For such people, the account of how at 17 one receives one's first stretch, at slightly over 20 one's first serious conviction, and then an endless chain of prison transfers already sounded like a legend from another age. But it was precisely these legends that formed the unspoken hierarchy. Those who had done time the old way were valued far more highly within the environment. It was in this contradiction between the old school and new money that the last known stages of Koba's criminal career played out. On the one hand, he was the bearer of the classical thieves' code. On the other, he understood perfectly that without adapting to a changed world, one became merely a museum exhibit. Therefore, he did not reject new schemes, did not refuse to participate in complex financial operations, did not decline to use modern communication tools. But he required that the foundation remain the same, the obszak, the code, and respect for one's word. When Taro was released from the Spanish prison, and voices in the criminal world began speaking again of a possible redistribution of influence, figures like Koba proved especially sought after. Men were needed who simultaneously remembered the old architecture of the criminal world and could speak the language of new realities, not those who rushed to the front ranks and flashed in the reports, but those who quietly built bridges between groups, cities, and generations. For the older criminal audience, this is a recognizable type, not the loudest, but the most durable. Within this saga, there lies another, deeper story, the story of how the memory of the criminal world is organized, how its traditions are transmitted, how one generation of thieves teaches another, not through books and lectures, but through silence, through glances, through stories told in hushed voices in prison cells. Koba was precisely such a teacher, not one who delivers sermons, but one who shows, through his own life, how to live and survive in this world. Young thieves who found themselves in his circle quickly understood. Posturing and empty words would not be accepted here. Only real deeds were valued, only the ability to keep one's word in the most difficult conditions. A story was told of how one young, crowned man, having received his status through money and connections, attempted to conduct himself with Koba as an equal and began holding forth on how business ought to be conducted. Koba listened to him in silence, then asked, "How many winters did you spend in a cell? How many times did you refuse offers from the administration? How many times could you have been released earlier but refused to make a deal?" The young thief fell silent because he had no answers. After that conversation, he understood. In the presence of men like Koba, your title means nothing if it is not backed by real prison experience. This system of transmitting knowledge through personal example was the foundation of the criminal world from the very beginning of its existence. In the 1930s, when in the Stalinist camps the caste of thieves-in-law was being formed, what mattered most was not wealth or connections, but the ability to survive in inhuman conditions while preserving one's dignity and loyalty to one's code. Those who broke under torture, who agreed to work for the administration, who betrayed their own, these were crossed out of the criminal world forever. And those who withstood every trial became legends on whom subsequent generations modeled themselves. Koba belonged to this tradition. He grew up in an era when there were still old men alive who had passed through Stalin's camps, when the thieves' laws were observed with iron strictness, when the slightest deviation from the code could cost you your life. That school hardened him and made him what he became, a man for whom his word
is worth more than his life, for whom the code takes precedence over any state law. His authority helped extinguish conflicts. When the parties could not reach agreement, people would often turn to him as an arbitrator. He would hear out both sides, weigh the arguments, and render a decision. And both sides would usually accept his decision because they knew that Koba was not biased, that he was guided not by personal interests, but by what was best for the criminal world as a whole. Parallel to the internal conflicts, the criminal world was facing growing pressure from states. Russia, European countries, even Georgia, everywhere anti-criminal legislation was being strengthened. Specialized units were being created to combat organized crime, and new methods of operative work were being introduced. In Russia, a law was adopted permitting the imprisonment of thieves-in-law simply for their status, without evidence of specific crimes. It was sufficient to prove that a person was a thief-in-law, and he automatically received a sentence. This was a serious blow to the criminal world, because previously, specific crimes had to be proven, which was often difficult. In Europe, too, measures against Eastern European organized crime were being tightened. Spain, France, Germany, and other countries created databases of criminal authorities, exchanged information, and coordinated their actions. Georgian thieves, who had previously felt relatively safe in Europe, now constantly risked arrest and extradition. The story of Taro showed how seriously European countries were committed to fighting organized crime. His arrest in Russia and extradition to Spain in 2019 became a resounding event in the criminal world. Many thieves understood that the times when one could peacefully live in Europe, enjoying the fruits of crime, were over. Now one had to constantly hide, change locations, and fear every stranger. But even under these conditions, the criminal world did not disappear. It adapted, as it had adapted many times over its more than century-long history. Thieves learned to act more covertly, to use new technologies to protect their information, and to create more complex money laundering schemes that were harder for law enforcement to trace. Koba, with his enormous experience, was a valuable source of knowledge for those who wanted to learn to survive in these new conditions. He remembered times when the state's pressure on crime had been even more brutal: the Stalinist camps, mass shootings, torture. Compared to what thieves had endured in the 1930s and 1940s, the modern methods of fighting crime seemed almost humane. The fate of Koba Bagdatsky is the fate of an entire generation of Georgian thieves-in-law who passed through all the trials of the post-Soviet era and remained true to their principles. This generation is departing. Its time is coming to an end. But the memory of it will remain in stories, in legends, in traditions that are still alive in the criminal world. Today, as the criminal world becomes ever more similar to ordinary business, as ideology is replaced by pure pragmatism, figures like Koba seem like visitors from another time. But it is precisely this archaism, this loyalty to fading values, that makes them compelling, worthy of respect and memory. The history of the criminal world continues, but it will never again be what it was in the era of Koba Bagdatsky and men like him. That era has ended, and with the departure of its last representatives, an entire stratum of criminal culture will pass into history, with its own rules, traditions, heroes, and legends. Koba was one of these last old men, the keepers of a dying world, and therein lies his place in history.